This is a production of Cornell University.
We're basically done with litter quality, but I wanted to talk a few minutes more about one more thing and when we're talking about litter quality, and that's this conversation between what's humic material versus humic acids, this sort of humic substances. And there's a big difference here, and I think perhaps the best way to sort of talk about that is this slide right here. Now, this is a slide that I used earlier in the lecture series, basically saying, okay, if this is the organic matter that comes into the soil, what happens to it? Well, the vast majority of it basically gets blown off as CO2, and a chunk of it turns into biomass. Now, this is a modification I've modified this from what was in the book. What was in the book was these complex humic compounds were here, and these non-humic compounds were here. The argument being that traditionally we thought of the larger pools of what was in the soil organic matter, the more resistant materials, to be these humic materials, okay? Versus what we have now discovered is really this is a product of our analysis. Okay, yes, there are some humic materials in these soils, humic versus humus, okay? Maybe 3%. In the past, we were thinking 30%, big numbers, okay? Now, of this non-humic compounds, the argument that I'm trying to lay out, or we've been trying to lay out recently, is that this has less to do with what it is and more to do with where it is, okay? Is it in a location that can be decomposed, and is it in a location that it has all of the organisms that need to do the decomposition and all the other compounds at the same time that need to be there for this material to be decomposed? Okay, does that make sense? Now this is a location, but it's a location that's both in space and in time. Okay, i.e. if it's a progression of decomposition products, that's a longitudinal issue. Okay, does that make sense to everybody? Okay, now having said that, I think it's worthwhile for us to talk about what these humic materials are. And to do that, let's actually talk about what humus is. Now, in the traditional sense, humus has this, we often think of humus as this colloidal material, this stuff that's recalcitrant, this stuff that's the byproduct. The reality is that when we talk about humus, technically, we're shifting that meaning. Humus is all of the organic material that's been decomposed or not decomposed that's in the soil. The humic material is the byproducts of this decomposition. That's that 3% of the total material. That's this small, very small pool here of material that is in fact resistant to decay due to that decomposition. Okay, these colloidal soil organic matter that decomposes slowly and colors the soils blacks or browns. Okay, in essence it's a glue. It's thought of as a glue that literally holds mineral particles together. Has two very important properties that are very similar to clay. One is that it's highly charged. This gets into the issue of CEC, cation exchange capacity, as well as anion exchange capacity. It has a large surface area. And it's very reactive in the soil despite its very low content. That's this high surface area and this high charged, okay? Because I have a high surface area and I'm highly charged, even though there's not very much of it, it is very reactive. Go.
I'm confused. You said humus and humic compounds aren't the same, but...
That's why I'm scratching this out. So traditionally, humus, we were thinking of this as these colloidal soil materials that are decomposed products. They're products of decomposition. That's not what we're thinking of them now. Humus now, the concept of what humus is the collection of all of the organic matter that's in there. In the past, humus material has been thought of as just this recalcitrant pool, this pool that is resistant to decay. And that is not actually what we're thinking of humus as now. Okay? The traditional term humus we now think of as humic compounds. Humic versus humus, or humus, hummus, not hummus. Okay, does that make sense to everybody? Fulvic or hemic acid. Okay, that's a see, that's the problem. You give me that look and like, what the heck is he talking about? The problem is, historically, for us to determine what this material was, we basically would put it into acid mixes, and we would digest it and see what we could come out, what we could make from it. Okay? And what we were determining was that we were producing all these hemic and fulvic acids. The result, the reality of it, though, was that we were actually making those. They didn't actually exist at the amounts that we were making in the real world. Yes, they do exist, but at very small quantities. But when we took this stuff, this organic matter, try to figure out, to elucidate what it was, we'd throw it in the lab, and we produce all these acids, and we'd say, oh, look, this is what's in the soil. When in reality, it's a product of what we were making, not what was actually out there. Does that make sense to everybody? Okay. Nowadays, what we can do, because we have tools that we can literally look. I mean, we have hyperspectral cameras, and really, I mean, we can actually look at what's in the soil, and we're looking at these materials. And the reality is that we're seeing all these sugars, we're seeing all different kinds of stuff, and we're seeing very few of these humic compounds relative to all of the organic matter that's out there. Does that make sense to everybody? So it really is a paradigm shift in what we think is in, or what we know is in these organic pools. Okay? Cool-ish? The properties of these humic compounds, again, they contain phenolic polymers, lots of carboxylics. They accumulate nitrogen and sulfur as it decays. This is real stuff. It's just not as much stuff as we previously thought. We thought all of the stuff that was in the soil that was resistant to decay or was not decaying, whichever one it was these humic compounds. But that is not the case. A very small pool is this. Most of the reason why things are not decomposing has to do with location, 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 both spatially and temporally. Now, there are real effects from these humic compounds. There is some of this stuff in the soil, okay? And this is straight out of your book. Can you guys actually see that one on the top? I'm hoping. The bottom one, you guys know what this is. You don't really need to see it. But basically, what we're looking at is here's the humic substance, the humic compound. There's a humic acid, humic and fulvic acids, humic acid, humic fulvic acids. They're looking at these concentration ranges. But what they're looking at is what do these things actually do in the soil? And it turns out that these are really good hormonal producers for plant behavior. It turns out that the humic acids at low concentrations accelerate water uptake and enhance germination of seeds. It's acting as a hormone, okay? The humic and fulvic acids at higher concentrations are basically stimulating root initiation and elongation. That's that second one down. Humic acids at lower concentrations are enhancing root cell elongation by themselves. And we're actually looking at fairly large concentrations where we actually see enhanced growth of plant shoots and roots. Okay, so these are acting as hormones. So there is a huge benefit to have these things in the soil. In fact, they're promoting plant growth. But the take-home message is that what we previously thought as this huge pool of humic and fulvic acids is in fact a rather small one. It's not to say that it doesn't have effects. It's just a much smaller pool, and most of the organic matter that we see in these soils are these other types, these primary materials, sugars, polysaccharides, okay, lignins, okay, even though the lignins decompose really quickly. Okay, sorry, I'm going to do this, and I know you guys don't like it when I do this. Take a look at this slide. If we were just looking at recalcitrance, the ability of something to be decomposed, its resistance to decay, the object that we should expect, the type of material that we should expect to see the most of in soils is this. It's extremely resistant to decay because of its structure. But if you look at the residence time of the materials that are in the soils, and the variety of different types of materials that are in that soil, lignin is decomposed rather quickly. Now, lignin is not a humic or fulvic acid, but its byproduct is, potentially. All of the byproducts of all of these things are potentially humic and fulvic acids. But the reality is we're not seeing them. The argument was, well, these things are building up because they are resistant to decay. But all we have to do is look at lignin, and we realize that decay rates, yes, they have some, the resistance to decay has some control, but it's not the driver. It's that location. Okay? Have I beaten this one really too much? Questions?
Yeah.
Go.
So how do humic compounds move in the soil? Like, so if you have a sand and you're adding, humus or whatever to it.
So the question is, how do these humic compounds move through the soils? Well, it turns out that they're basically acidic materials, and they move through with water, soluble. So a really good example of this would be looking at those spodosoils that we saw in the very beginning of the semester. Those red colors and browns that we see in those, you guys remember spodosoils? Boreal forest soils, they have a dark A horizon, very distinct, very bright E horizon with BHs and BSs underneath them, BHSs. Okay, those browns that we see down below, those are those humic and fulvic acids. Okay, remember I was talking about what the properties of humic and we just talked about it. Sorry about this. I know you guys hate me doing this. Where is that color thing? Contains phenolic polymers. These confer dark colors. These are those dark colors that we're seeing coming down. And these are just the acids that are moving down. Okay, these are the same acids that are stripping stuff above. These are fairly strong acids. I mean, they're not sulfuric acid, but they're fairly strong acids. Okay, does that make sense? Has anybody been up to the Adirondacks or the Tug Hill? And you go through the Black River, and you look at these streams, and they're really dark brown, almost blackish red. That's these acids. Questions? In the sandy soil, it moves. Okay? And in fact, in the sandy soils, we have spodosoils in Florida. Okay? Very different. It's not a boreal forest, but because of these sandy soils and the type of plants that are growing on top, you get these, that we call them groundwater spodosoils. The groundwater hits, transports, we have these very distinct spodosoils. Go.
The reading for what you were saying of the lignins seems contrary. Is the book not
The book is wrong.
The book is wrong. Okay, so I
This whole idea, so she was asking, the readings that you're reading in the book about this seems very contrary to what I'm saying. And maybe I shouldn't, well, the theory is, the paradigm that we're shifting right now indicates that the stuff that is in the book is wrong, okay? And that's why we modify this. The book has this here and this here. And the reality is, I want you to think about what's going on here. It's really about this location. This is the driver. It's the environment that is driving these decompositions.
So if we learn better by reading, which I do, I need to read that Nature article.
You need to read that Nature article. And if anybody is interested in some more articles on this very particular subject, I have a couple of them, two of them. One is the one that's in Nature, where Johannes Lehmann is one of the authors, and there's another one that's in the Journal of European Journal of Soil Science, I think. That's another really good sort of brings it all together, what's going on here. Okay? Cool? So, this is basically what we've been talking about, okay? These factors that are controlling organic matter decay. Primarily, it's a biotic, abiotic ecosystem properties, with the driver really being placement, location, proximity, time. Size and surface area also has a huge role, as does the CN ratio when we start talking about litter quality. Okay, this is what drives them. Okay, now, since we've been talking about what's driving the decay processes, maybe we actually should talk about where this material is, okay, and how we actually sort of partition it. Traditionally, the partition has looked like this, okay, and this is straight out of your book as well. Okay? Basically, we're looking at plant residues with different types of carbon content, high lignin carbon versus low nitrogen versus high CN ratios, and basically looking at its residence time. Okay? This material decomposes and basically, or is deposited and basically goes into 3 different pools. Okay? That's the traditional idea about where this stuff goes. Now, the reality, actually, stop. These 3 pools we call the active pool, the slow pool, and the passive pool. The active pool is the active area. Basically, we're looking at return rates about 1 to 2 years. This stuff has a residency time of about 1 to 2 years. The slow SOM pool basically has a residency time of about 15 to 100 years. And the passive pool, we're talking about 500 to 5,000 years. Okay, that's traditional view. Okay, and these pools, the reality of these pools, they do in fact exist, but what's in the pools have changed. Our concept of what's actually in these pools is changing, so that what we're really seeing is it doesn't really matter what the structural nature or the litter quality is. It really has to do with its location. And if it is in a location that is unavailable for decomposition, it literally can last a really long time. Okay, does that make sense to everybody? Now, if we think about this in an ecological sense, I originally did this as an agronomic sense, but if we're changing the concept of these pools, we really should be changing our concept changing our concept of what's actually in these pools. We should actually start to change our concept of how the pools work. So you can certainly think of this as an ecological system. Okay, we have CO2 in the system, in the atmosphere. That CO2 is photosynthesized into some sort of biomass by the plants. This plant production then drives the carbon into the soil. Okay, some of this stuff is harvested as food by animals, and their waste can also go into the soil. Okay, this material comes out as residues and roots. The roots basically are biomass that are in the soil but are alive. Okay, the residues are the things like leaves and sloughing off of root tips and things like that going into this biomass. This is a term that we call humification. It's probably not a good term to use anymore. Okay, but we're basically looking at the transfer of this residual material into the soil organic matter pools. Okay, this manure potentially can go in as well. Okay, this material will somewhere down the line oxidize. Basically, it's going to be respired, which means it's going to be released as CO2. Some of this stuff can be turned and leached out and turned into carbonates, and some of this stuff can be lost as erosion. But this pool somewhere down the line, unless it goes subaqueous in the bottom of the ocean, this pool is probably going to be decomposed as well. Okay? These pools really represent time. They no longer represent what's actually in them. Again, it's that location, location, location.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.